The cargo ship drifted through space like a wounded animal, and smoke poured from its broken engines while emergency lights flickered inside the dark corridors. Jake Morrison crouched behind a metal wall that had been torn apart by plasma fire, and his hand pressed against his left side, where blood soaked through his uniform. 3 hours ago, his squad had been alive, and now he was the only one left breathing. The Krell raiders had come without warning, and their ships appeared from behind the asteroids like angry insects. Their weapons tore through the colony defenses before anyone could react, and Jake's unit had been on patrol when the attack started. He watched his friends die one by one, and now the aliens were hunting through the wreckage looking for survivors to capture. Jake heard the clicking sounds getting closer, and he knew what those sounds meant. The Krell were insect creatures that walked on 2 legs and had 4 arms, and their mouths had sharp parts that clicked when they talked. These were not just raiders who stole supplies. These were slavers who took prisoners and sold them to fight in arenas across the galaxy. He checked his rifle and saw only 3 bullets left. That was not enough to fight his way out, and he knew it. The clicking grew louder, and Jake gripped his weapon tighter even though pain burned in his side. If he was going to die here, then he would take some of these creatures with him. A huge shadow fell across his hiding spot, and Jake turned fast with his finger on the trigger, but something heavy hit his chest before he could shoot. The impact threw him through a weak wall, and his rifle flew away into the darkness. He tried to stand, but his legs would not work right, and he fell. 4 Krell warriors surrounded him, and their tall bodies blocked the light. The biggest one had scars on its shell and wore stolen military badges from soldiers it had killed. It leaned down to look at Jake, and its many eyes reflected his bloody face like a broken mirror. The creature made clicking sounds, and a machine on its chest turned the clicks into words that Jake could understand. The Krell said the human soldier was still alive, and that was good because arena masters paid well for fighters. It said they paid even more for ones with spirit. Jake tried to reach for the knife on his belt, but another Krell stepped on his arm, and the pressure was so strong he thought his bones would break. He could not move and could barely breathe. Another Krell said this one was injured and might die before they reached the arena planet. The leader made a dismissive, clicking sound and said they would sell him quickly. The arena always needed fresh fighters, and even weak human fighters were worth something. They stuck a needle in Jake's arm, and cold liquid spread through his body like ice water. His vision became blurry, and he tried to stay awake but could not. The last thing he saw was the Krell leader's face looking down at him with what seemed like a smile. When Jake woke up, the cargo ship was gone, and he was in a medical pod. The pod opened with a hissing sound, and he saw he was in a small cell made of strong metal. His wound had been treated with some kind of foam that itched and burned. They had kept him alive, but just barely. Through the small window in his cell door, Jake could see many other cells with prisoners inside. Some were human, but many were aliens he had never seen before. All of them had the same look in their eyes. They knew they were going to die. A mechanical voice spoke in many languages at once, and Jake's translator implant in his ear processed the words. The voice said new arrivals would be processed in 1 cycle, and arena combat would begin at dawn. It said fight well and you might earn freedom, but disappoint the crowd and you will die. It welcomed them to Vortan Prime. Jake pressed his face against the cold window, trying to see more of where he was. Somewhere in this place there had to be a way out or a weakness he could exploit. He was a Marine, and Marines were trained for impossible situations. But as hours passed and he watched the guards move through the halls, Jake felt reality settle on him like a heavy weight. The guards were huge creatures from many different alien species, and all of them carried big weapons. This was not a mission he could fight his way out of. This was a death sentence with an audience watching. In the cell across from his, a young woman with short blonde hair caught his eye. She looked human and was around 25 years old, with a thin body like someone who grew up on a planet with low gravity. Her eyes met his, and she mouthed 2 words without speaking out loud. She said, "Stay strong." Jake nodded slowly and felt a little better. He did not know her name or her story, but in that moment, she represented something he needed badly. She represented hope that he was not completely alone in this nightmare. The lights in the cell area suddenly dimmed to signal sleep time. Jake lay down on the hard metal bench that was his bed, and every muscle in his body hurt. His sealed wound throbbed with pain that felt real even though the injury was closed. Tomorrow they would force him into an arena to fight for the entertainment of creatures who saw him as nothing more than an animal. Tomorrow he might die in front of thousands of aliens who would cheer for his death. But Jake Morrison was a human Marine. and humans had a reputation across the galaxy. That reputation was built on one simple truth that every species learned eventually. Humans did not give up, and humans did not surrender. When humans were wounded, they became more dangerous, and when humans were cornered, they fought harder. Other species might accept their fate and die quietly, but humans were different. Jake closed his eyes and tried to rest because tomorrow would come fast. Tomorrow he would enter the arena and face whatever opponent they chose for him. He was injured and weak and alone in a place designed to kill him. The odds of survival were almost zero, but almost zero was not zero, and as long as Jake was breathing, he would fight. He would make them work for every inch and every second. He would show these aliens why humans were feared across the stars. He would prove that even a wounded human was more dangerous than they could imagine. That was the human way, and nothing would make him forget it. Morning came too fast, and Jake was torn from his uncomfortable sleep when his cell door slammed open with a loud noise. Two guards walked in, and they were huge reptile creatures with gray scales and cold yellow eyes. They did not say anything and just grabbed Jake by his arms and pulled him into the corridor. Outside, he was pushed along with many other prisoners, through hallways that went deeper, into the facility, and the air became warmer as they walked. Jake could hear something in the distance, and it was the sound of thousands of voices all shouting together. The sound was so loud it made the walls shake. They came out into a large area under the arena floor, and this space was divided into cages that held fighters of different species. Jake was shoved into a cage with 5 other humans, and the blonde woman from the cell across from his was there, along with 3 men and another woman with dark skin. The blonde woman moved closer to Jake and asked if this was his first time. Up close he could see old scars on her hands, and the way she moved told him she knew how to fight. Jake said yes and looked at the other prisoners to see what kind of people they were. The woman said her name was Lisa Grant, and she used to work on cargo ships before getting captured 6 months ago. She pointed to the others and said their names were Danny and Kevin and Marcus. The other woman was Nicole Shaw, who did not talk much. Danny was a thin man who seemed very nervous, and he laughed in a bitter way. He said talking does not help much when you are about to be torn apart by something with 4 arms and acid for blood. Jake asked how this whole thing worked and what he should expect. Lisa leaned against the bars of their cage, and her face looked grim. She said they would send fighters up in groups, and sometimes it was 1 fighter against 1 fighter. Sometimes it was teams fighting each other, and sometimes they just threw prisoners in with dangerous animals and watched what happened. Jake asked what happens if they win. Marcus answered and said, they get to do it again tomorrow. Marcus was older than the rest and had gray hair mixed with black. He said the arena promised freedom after 10 victories, but he had seen hundreds of fighters come through this place. Not one had made it past 7 wins. An electronic sound rang through the area, and a holographic screen appeared above the cages showing the arena floor. The crowd was huge, with tens of thousands of alien spectators filling seats that went up toward a domed ceiling hundreds of meters high. Jake felt his stomach tighten as he watched a fight that was happening right now. A 4-armed Krell warrior stood over the broken body of something that looked like a giant slug. The crowd roared with approval as the Krell raised all 4 arms in victory. Lisa said quietly that the Krell's name was Vextor, and he was their champion. She said he had 23 wins in a row, and they were saving him for the main event. The holographic screen changed and showed names of fighters who would fight next. Jake saw his own face appear along with words that said human and injured and newly captured. His opponent's image showed up next to his, and it was another Krell but smaller than Vextor. The creature's name appeared in several languages, and it said Krazik the Breaker. Kevin said Jake got matched with a Krell soldier, and that was bad luck. He said Krell were born and raised just for fighting. Jake studied the image of his opponent carefully. The Krell had scars on its shell, but the shell looked strong, and it had 4 arms that ended in sharp claws that could cut through metal. Jake had fought Krell before during border wars, and he knew their weak points and how they moved. The problem was Jake's own condition, because his wound had been sealed but not truly healed. He was maybe at 60% of his normal strength, and in a fight like this that could mean death. Guards started opening the cages and separating fighters to send them to different platforms. Jake found himself standing on a circular platform with weapon racks along the edges. He could choose what weapons to use. He picked a simple combat knife and a short staff with heavy ends. These were light and fast and good for someone who needed to be quick. Lisa grabbed Jake's arm before the platform started rising and told him to listen carefully. She said Krell have two brains, and one is in the head and one is in the lower chest. She said headshots will not kill them fast enough. Jake needed to hit the chest area or the joints where the arms connect to the body. She also said never let them grab you because their strength is 3 times stronger than humans. Jake nodded and memorized everything she said. He thanked her. Lisa said, "Do not thank me yet and just try to survive." The platform jerked upward and carried Jake toward the arena floor. The sound of the crowd grew louder with each second until it felt like the noise was pushing against him, like a physical force. Light flooded his eyes as he came up into the arena. The space was enormous and easily 200 meters across. The floor was covered in sand that was stained dark brown with blood from countless fighters who had died here. The alien spectators filled every seat, and they were many different species, all united in wanting to see violence. Across the arena, another platform rose carrying Krasik the Breaker, and the Krell warrior was even bigger in person. Its body was covered in battle, scarred armor, and it carried no weapons because its clawed arms were weapons by themselves. Floating announcer machine hovered above the center of the arena, and its voice was so loud it echoed everywhere. Jake's translator worked hard to process the words into language he could understand. The announcer said citizens of Vorton Prime should watch the next entertainment. It said in the Eastern Gate they had Krasik the Breaker, who was a veteran of 14 arena victories, and a decorated soldier of the Krell military. The crowd roared with approval. The announcer then said in the Western Gate they had a newly captured human soldier who was wounded and weak and desperate. The announcer's tone was mocking. It said, "Let us see how long this soft-skinned creature can last against a true warrior." Krasik started moving toward Jake and spread all 4 arms wide in an intimidating display. The creature's mouth parts clicked rapidly, and its translator broadcast the sounds into words. Krasik said, "Look at the human who was bleeding and broken." It said Jake should have died with honor in battle, but instead would die here for their amusement. The Krell said it would make the death quick because Jake was not worth taking time with. Jake said nothing and just shifted his stance with knife in one hand and staff in the other. He waited. Krasik paused because it clearly expected some response like fear or anger or begging. When Jake remained silent, the Krell's mouth parts spread in that terrible smile. Then the creature threw back its head and laughed with a clicking sound that echoed across the arena. The alien crowd joined. In and thousands of voices mocked the injured human who dared to stand before a Krell warrior. Jake let them laugh and used the time to measure distances and calculate angles and prepare his mind. The laughter was still echoing when the starting signal blared across the arena. Krasik charged forward with surprising speed, and all 4 arms reached out to grab and tear. Jake moved. Time seemed to slow down as Krasik closed the distance between them, and Jake's training kicked in to overlay tactical calculations over his fear. The Krell was fast, but Jake had studied their movement patterns during the border wars. They relied on overwhelming strength in making their opponents panic. Against fighters who were scared, it worked perfectly. Jake was not panicking. The Krell's upper arms reached for him first with claws spread wide to grab and crush. Jake dropped into a slide and sand sprayed around him as he passed beneath the creature's guard. He drove his staff upward as he moved and slammed the weighted end into the joint where one of the Krell's middle arms connected to its body. The shell cracked with a sound like breaking glass, and Krasik shrieked more in surprise than pain. The creature spun faster than Jake expected, and a lower arm caught him across the shoulder, sending him tumbling across the sand. Jake rolled with the impact and came up in a crouch while pain blazed from his sealed wound. The foam held, but barely. He could feel warmth spreading beneath his vest. The wound was opening again. The crowd's laughter had stopped, and now there was only the roar of excitement. Thousands of aliens watched a fight that might actually be interesting. Krasik circled him carefully now, with one arm hanging limp from the damaged joint. The Krell's mouth parts clicked rapidly, and it spoke in its own language without using the translator. Jake did not need a translator to understand the tone, which was pure fury. The creature charged again, but this time it was more careful and kept its damaged arm protected while using the other 3 to push Jake toward the arena wall. It was a smart move. Against the wall, Jake would have nowhere to dodge. Jake let himself be pushed backward and counted steps while measuring angles. 15 meters from the wall, then 10 meters, then 5. The Krell lunged, and all 3 working arms drove forward like spears. Jake threw his staff directly at the creature's eyes, and it was a desperate move that left him without a defensive weapon. But it worked. Krayzik flinched and turned its head by instinct to protect its vision. In that tiny fraction of a second, Jake darted forward instead of backward. He went low beneath the Krell's guard and drove his combat knife up into the softer shell of the chest joint, where Lisa had told him to aim. The blade sank deep, and Jake twisted it with all his remaining strength. Krayzik screamed with a high-pitched sound that hurt Jake's ears. The creature's lower brain was there in the chest, and it controlled movement and basic functions. Jake pulled the knife free and stabbed again, then again, and drove the blade deeper with each strike. The Krell staggered backward, and its legs lost coordination. One arm swung wildly and caught Jake across the face, splitting his lip. But the blow lacked strength. Krayzik was dying as its motor functions failed because the lower brain stopped working. Jake pulled his knife free one final time and backed away to watch the massive creature collapse to its knees. Krayzik's upper brain was still working and still aware. Its eyes found Jake through its fading vision, and its translator spoke one last time. The Krell said it was impossible because Jake was weak and broken, and asked how this could happen. Jake said quietly and too low for the translator to hear that it was because he was human. He said humans do not quit. Krayzik the Breaker fell forward into the sand and did not move anymore. The arena fell completely silent for 3 full seconds, and then the crowd erupted, with a sound so loud it felt like a physical blow. Some spectators were cheering because they were thrilled by the upset. Others were roaring in anger because they had lost money betting on what should have been an easy victory for the Krell warrior. Jake stood over his fallen opponent and breathed hard with his face bloody, and his wound leaking red through his vest. From the charge to the final blow, the fight had lasted just under 60 seconds. The announcer machine's voice cut through the noise and said it was incredible. It said the human had defeated Krayzik the Breaker, and 14 victories were rendered meaningless by a wounded and supposedly weak opponent. It said the crowd had witnessed something rare today, which was the fury of a desperate creature with nothing left to lose. Jake looked up at the rows of spectators and at the countless alien faces watching him. Some looked impressed and many looked angry, but all of them were thinking differently about the injured human who had just killed a decorated Krell warrior in single combat. The platform beneath Jake's feet began to lower and carried him back down to the staging area. As he went down, he saw Lisa and the others pressed against the bars of their cage, staring at him with expressions of shock and something that might have been hope. The moment Jake stepped off the platform, medical machines swarmed him and sprayed antiseptic foam over his reopened wound while checking his vital signs. They worked with mechanical speed and stabilized him just enough to keep him alive for the next fight. Lisa said that was insane as guards brought Jake back to the human cage. She said no one beats a Krell warrior on their first time in the arena, and especially not while injured. Jake slumped against the bars while exhaustion crashed over him now that the adrenaline was fading. He asked how long until the next fight. Lisa said for him they would probably give him a rest day to let him recover enough to be entertaining again. Marcus handed Jake a container of water through the bars and said Jake had their attention now. He said that was good and bad. Jake asked why it was bad while drinking deeply. Nicole Shaw spoke for the first time, and her voice was rough from not being used. She said champions attract challengers, and they would want to see if Jake was lucky or actually skilled. Through the bars, Jake could see other fighters in their cages watching him with new interest. Some looked hostile and viewed him as competition. Others seemed to be calculating and perhaps seeing an opportunity for alliance. But one figure drew Jake's attention more than the others, and in a cage separated from everyone else and heavily guarded was the largest Krell Jake had ever seen. This was Vexthor the champion with 23 victories. The massive warrior was watching Jake with all the focus of a predator studying new prey. As their eyes met across the staging area, Vexthor's mouth parts spread slowly into that terrible smile. Then the champion did something unexpected and raised one massive arm and tapped it twice against his chest right where Jake had killed Krayzik. The message was clear and said, "I know your technique and it will not work twice." Jake met the champion's gaze without looking away. He had survived one fight and had no illusions about surviving 10 more, but he would fight and make them work for every victory. If he was going to die in this arena, he would die on his feet with a weapon in his hand. That was the human way, and Jake would not forget it even if it killed him. Jake spent the next 2 days in a blur of pain and forced recovery, and the medical machines kept him alive but just barely. The arena masters wanted their fighters healthy enough to put on a good show, but not so healthy they could escape or fight back against their captors. During those 2 days, Jake fought twice more. The first fight was against a Vortok, which was a bear-like creature from a high-gravity world. It was strong and vicious, but slow. Jake used his speed advantage and stayed out of reach while hitting the joints and tendons until the creature could no longer stand. The crowd loved it because the underdog human warrior was using cunning to overcome a stronger opponent. The second fight was a team battle, and Jake and 3 other humans were put against a pack of 6 razor hounds. These were genetically engineered predators bred specifically for arena combat. One of the humans died in the first 30 seconds and was torn apart by the hound's sharp teeth. But Jake and Lisa and a man named Cole managed to work together. They formed a triangle and protected each other's backs and killed the hounds one by one in a methodical way. When the dust settled, Jake had 3 victories and Lisa had 5. The crowd was beginning to recognize their faces and chant their names with the same enthusiasm they once had for Vexthor. Between fights, Jake learned about how the arena worked. Fighters who survived long enough became celebrities and earned better food in private cells and even some limited privileges. But these comforts came with a price because the longer you survived, the more dangerous your opponents became. Lisa said on the 3rd night after Jake's latest victory that they were building him up for something. They were allowed to share a cell now, which was a privilege earned through their growing victory count. She said the crowd loved him and had been calling him the Wounded Warrior. She said they were making up stories about his last stand against the Krell Raiders. Jake sat on the edge of his bed and cleaned his knife with a scrap of cloth. The blade had saved his life 4 times now. He said let them tell their stories because he just wanted to survive. Lisa said quietly that was what she thought too at first. She said, but then she started to hope and started to think maybe she really could win 10 times and earn her freedom. She laughed in a bitter way and said that is how they keep us fighting. She said hope is the cruelest weapon of all. Jake asked how many victories she needed. Lisa said 5 more, but her next opponent was a Thraxian Blade Master. She said they were genetically designed for combat with reflexes 3 times faster than human normal. Her hands shook slightly as she spoke. She said she had seen them fight and they do not just kill you. They cut you apart piece by piece to make it last for the crowd's entertainment. Jake set down his knife and looked at her. He said then we train and asked how much time they had. Maybe 16 hours before her fight and they should use that time. Lisa asked train with what because they do not give practice weapons. Jake said they do not need weapons and they need strategy. He said show me how they move and I will watch your next fight from below. If I see an opening, I will signal you. They spent the next hours practicing with Lisa, showing the flowing and deadly movements of the Thraxian fighting style and Jake pointing out potential weaknesses. It was not much, but it was something. In a place like this, even a small advantage could mean the difference between life and death. The next day, Lisa entered the arena to face her Thraxian opponent, and Jake watched from the staging area, pressed against the bars of his cage along with dozens of other fighters. The Thraxian was exactly as Lisa had described and impossibly fast with its blade-like arms moving in a blur of lethal precision. But Lisa had listened to Jake's advice and instead of trying to match the Thraxian's speed, she fought defensively. She waited for the creature to overextend, and when it did by committing fully to a killing strike, Lisa was not where it expected. She had rolled left instead of right and broke the pattern she had established. The Thraxian's blade cut through empty air and Lisa drove her knife up into the soft tissue beneath its armored body. It was not a killing blow, but it was enough. The Thraxian's speed became its weakness as it tried to spin around while bleeding and lost its balance. Lisa followed up with 3 more precise strikes and the Blade Master fell. The crowd went wild because 2 humans were both approaching their freedom and both defying the odds. That was when Jake realized the truth that Nicole had hinted at days earlier. The arena masters would never let them go, and not really. They were too valuable now and too popular. The crowd loved their story of the wounded human and his ally fighting against impossible odds. They would die here one way or another, and the only question was when. Jake's 4th fight came that evening and he was matched against a former champion. The creature was called a Bone Ripper and had supposedly killed 37 opponents before being defeated by Vexthor himself. The Bone Ripper had survived that loss and been working its way back up through the ranks ever since. It was a terrifying opponent standing 3 meters tall and covered in natural armor plates. Its arms ended in bone spikes that could punch through steel. But Jake had learned something important during his time in the arena. Every creature, no matter how strong or well-armored, had weaknesses. The Bone Ripper's weakness was its rage because it fought with pure aggression and overwhelmed opponents through fear and relentless assault. Against a panicked fighter, it was unstoppable. Jake did not panic. He led the creature on a chase around the arena, and always stayed just out of reach while forcing it to use energy. The crowd booed because they wanted to see blood, but Jake ignored them. He waited for the Bone Ripper to grow frustrated and make a mistake. It took 7 minutes, but the mistake came. The creature lunged with both arms extended and put all its weight behind a strike meant to pin Jake against the arena wall. Jake dropped flat to the sand and rolled between the Bone Ripper's legs. As he came up behind the creature, he drove his knife into the gap between 2 armor plates at the base of its spine. The blade sank deep and cut the nerve cluster that controlled the lower body. The Bone Ripper collapsed and was paralyzed from the waist down. Jake ended its suffering quickly and earned a mixture of cheers and angry jeers from the crowd. 4 victories and 6 more to go. But as guards took him back to the staging area, Jake saw something that made his blood run cold. The massive gate leading to Vexthor's isolated cage was open. The champion was being moved and prepared for something. The announcer machine's voice echoed through the facility and said, "Citizens of Vortan Prime had a special event scheduled for tomorrow." It said the human known as the Wounded Warrior would face their champion Vexthor in single combat. This was a rare opportunity to see a rising challenger against an established champion. It told everyone to place their bets because tomorrow they would see if the human's victories had been skill or simply luck. Jake's stomach dropped because he had 4 victories, not 10. They were not going to let him work his way up. They were throwing him to the champion now while the story was fresh and while the crowds were excited. Lisa grabbed his arm when he returned to their cell and said he could not fight Vexthor. She said no one beats him because he is faster than Krell and stronger than Bone Rippers and smarter than any of them. She said he has killed 43 opponents, including 7 other champions. Jake said quietly that he did not have a choice. Lisa's grip tightened on his arm and she said then he needed to know something. She said Vexthor does not just kill for sport, but is the arena's enforcer. Fighters who get too popular and who start giving the others hope and who threaten to actually win 10 victories all end up facing him, and they all die. Jake understood then that the arena was not just entertainment but was control. Hope was allowed, but only to a point. Let the fighters dream of freedom and let them win just enough to stay. Desperate, but never let them actually escape. He looked at Lisa and at the hope and fear fighting in her eyes and made a decision. He said, "Then I am going to do something no one expects," and said, "I am going to win." The arena was packed to capacity for Jake's fight against Vexthor, and word had spread throughout Vortan Prime about the injured human who had defied the odds. Spectators from across the system had come to witness what most assumed would be his final match. Jake stood on the rising platform and felt the weight of thousands of eyes upon him. His wound had healed to the point where he could move without pain, though the scar tissue remained tight and tender. The medical machines had done their work, but they could not restore him to full capacity. He was perhaps 80% of his normal strength. Against Vexthor it would not be enough. The champion emerged from the opposite platform like a force of nature, and Vexthor was massive and easily the largest Krell Jake had ever encountered. His shell was decorated with trophies which were bits of armor and bone from fallen opponents. Unlike the other Krell, that Vexthor carried weapons which were a pair of curved blades attached to his middle arms, and each one was stained dark with the blood of countless kills. The announcer machine's voice boomed across the arena and said citizens should witness the main event. It said Vexthor was champion of Vortan Prime and holder of 43 consecutive victories. Against him was the human called the Wounded Warrior, who had defied expectations to claim 4 victories despite his injuries. The crowd roared with a sound so loud it made Jake's teeth rattle. Bets were being placed and fortunes were changing hands. Most of the money was on Vexthor naturally, but Jake could see from the betting displays that a surprising number of spectators had wagered on him. Not to win perhaps, but to last more than a few minutes. Vexthor began walking toward the center of the arena, and his movements were unhurried and confident. When he was close enough, his translator activated. The champion said he had watched Jake's victories and said Jake fought with cunning by exploiting the weaknesses of lesser creatures. Vexthor's mouth parts clicked slowly and he said, "But I am not lesser." He said I am the perfection of combat evolution, and asked what weakness will you exploit in me. Jake did not respond, and was counting steps, and measuring distances, and running calculations in his head. Vexthor was right about one thing because the champion had no obvious weaknesses. His armor was thicker and his movements more controlled, and his intelligence was evident in the way he positioned himself. To cut off escape routes, this was not going to be like the other fights, and this was going to require something different. The starting signal blared. Vexthor did not charge like Krezek had, and instead he advanced slowly with his forearms, positioned to defend and attack at the same time. The twin blades in his middle arms moved in small, controlled circles and were ready to block or strike in an instant. Jake circled and looked for an opening that did not exist. He made fake attacks twice to test Vexthor's reactions. The champion barely moved and simply adjusted his guard to compensate. No wasted motion and no overcommitment. Vexthor said Jake was thinking and said good. He said a thinking opponent provides better entertainment before they die. Jake continued circling and his mind raced. Every technique he had used in previous fights would not work here. Speed and surprise and targeting weak points would all fail. Vexthor was too skilled and too prepared. Then Jake remembered something from his military training, which was a lesson about fighting stronger opponents. When facing a superior opponent, you do not beat them at their own game. You change the game entirely. Jake stopped circling and stood still. He let his knife hand drop slightly, and his posture relaxed from a combat stance to something more neutral. To the crowd, it might have looked like surrender, or like the human accepting his fate. Vexthor's eyes studied him carefully, and asked, "What trick is this?" Jake said no trick, and his voice carried across the arena through his translator. He said, "I am just tired of pretending this is a fair fight." Vexthor replied that no fight is fair and said only fools expect fairness in combat. Jake said, "Then let us stop fighting." "Fair." Jake threw his knife, not at Vexthor, because the champion would have blocked it easily. Instead, Jake threw it straight up as high as he could and spinning end over end toward the domed ceiling far above. Vexthor's eyes tracked the knife by instinct for a fraction of a second where his attention was divided. In that fraction of a second, Jake charged forward faster than he had moved in any previous fight and pushed his injured body beyond its limits. He did not try to attack and instead dove between Vexthor's legs and slid through the sand past the champion's defenses. As he slid, he grabbed one of Vexthor's lower legs and pulled with all his strength. The champion was too massive to knock over, but Jake was not trying to knock him over. He was trying to turn him and rotate his body so that Vexthor was facing the wrong direction when the knife came back down, and come down it did while spinning, blade over handle and accelerating under gravity. Vexthor realized the trap too late and tried to move, but Jake was still gripping his leg and using his body weight as an anchor. The knife plunged down and buried itself in the softer shell at the back of Vexthor's neck, right where the primary brain connected to the spine. It was not a killing blow and not immediately, but it was a crippling one. Vexthor staggered and his upper arms lost coordination. The champion's blades clattered to the sand as his middle arms went into spasm. Jake released his grip and rolled away while coming up in a crouch several meters distant. The crowd had gone silent and was shocked by the audacity of the move. Vexthor reached back with a lower arm and tried to pull the knife free, but his motor control was failing. The blade had damaged something critical and interrupted the signals between brain and body. The champion said impossible, and his translator barely functioned. He said, "You are human and weak and fragile." Jake stood slowly and watched as Vortan Prime's champion struggled to maintain his balance. He said, "You know what the galaxy keeps forgetting about humans?" He said, "We do not just fight harder when we are wounded." He said, "We fight smarter and we adapt and we endure." Vexthor fell to his knees and his massive body no longer responded properly to his commands. His eyes found Jake, and for the first time there was something other than confidence in that gaze. There was confusion and perhaps even a trace of respect. Vexthor demanded, "Finish it," and said, "Grant me a warrior's death." Jake walked forward and retrieved one of the fallen blades. It was heavy in his hands and designed for the champion's superior strength. But Jake managed to lift it and the edge gleamed in the arena lights. Jake said quietly while standing over the kneeling champion that Vexthor had said, "No fight is fair." He said, "You were right, but that just means the unfair fights go both ways." He brought the blade down cleanly and ended Vexthor's reign. The arena remained silent for a heartbeat longer, and then chaos erupted. Some spectators were cheering and ecstatic at witnessing the impossible. Others were rioting and smashing seats and attacking each other as fortunes were lost and won. The arena masters had to deploy security machines to restore order. The announcer machine's voice struggled to be heard over the noise and said, "The champion has fallen." It said the human known as the Wounded Warrior has achieved the impossible by defeating Vexthor in single combat. This marked his 5th victory, 5 victories and halfway to freedom. But as guards took Jake back down to the staging area, he saw something that made his chest tighten with hope and fear together. The arena masters were in a heated discussion, and their gestures were aggressive, and their voices raised even through the translator static. They had not expected this, and had not planned for it. A human defeating their champion changed everything, including the betting, markets, and the fighter rankings. And the entire power structure of the arena, Lisa, was waiting in their cell when Jake arrived, and tears streamed down her face. She said he actually did it and said he killed Vexthor. Jake said one fight at a time and collapsed onto his bed. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest and his wound throbbed despite the medical attention he had received. Lisa grabbed his shoulders and forced him to look at her. She said, "No, you do not understand." She said Vexthor was not just a champion, but was their enforcer and their guarantee that no fighter would ever truly win freedom. With him dead, the system is vulnerable. If Jake wins 5 more times, then maybe freedom is possible. Jake interrupted and said, "If I win 5 more times, they will find another way to kill me." He said, "They will never let me go," and said, "We both know that." Nicole's voice came from the next cell, and the usually silent woman was pressed against the bars. Her eyes burned with sudden intensity, and she said then, "We do not wait for them to act." She said Jake had given them something and given them proof that they can be beaten. Over the next hour, as word of Vexthor's death spread through the staging area, something remarkable happened. Fighters from dozens of different species began gathering near the human cages. They did not speak and did not organize openly because such things would attract the guards' attention. But the message passed through gestures and glances. The champion was dead and the impossible had happened. If one thing previously thought impossible could occur, then perhaps another could too. Perhaps escape was not impossible after all. Jake looked at the assembled fighters and at the hope and desperation in their alien eyes. He felt the weight of responsibility settle over him. He had come to the arena as a prisoner, expecting only to die with dignity,